I welcome you to Raphael, the power of Renaissance images, the Dresden tapestries, and their impact. This is an exhibition that is very dear to my heart. We don't do a lot of old master projects here. I think when you think about old master projects, you go to Cleveland, right? Yeah, you know you do. You go to Cleveland. If you're staying in this state, you're going to Cleveland. Because, you know, Columbus was always born in the moment. We were always that, you know, there's always, you know, what's happening now, what's happening in the future. So we really are about, you know, we were kind of born in that modernist moment, and we spend a lot of time working with modernism and contemporary and photography and self-taught art, things that I absolutely love. But a big secret that very few of you would ever know, before I was an Americanist, I actually was in graduate school an early Italian Renaissance person. So I do have this sort of love of the old masters, and one of the greatest joys in my time as director has been our relationship with the Gemäldegalerie Gallery Altmeister and its director since 2016, Stefan Koya, who I actually know when he was in Vienna at the Belvedere. And this is our second project that we're bringing to you. You may remember 2018, remember the portrait of the Lady in White? That wonderful Titian portrait, yes, that is from their collection. They had recently conserved it, and we built an exhibition around it. And my colleague, David Stark, who is the chief curator emeritus, headed up that project. And he and Carol Ginshaft on our team were two people that headed up the project here and with Raphael. This project was born of you don't celebrate the death of someone. In recognition of the 500th anniversary of the death of Raphael in 1520, and we were to do it back to back, but they put the show up in Dresden just as COVID was closing the world down. We waited 2 years to do it then, to bring it back together, but it was always an exclusive relationship between the two museums, and I am really proud to tell you, you're about to see 6 tapestries that have never visited the United States. And for those of a certain age, like me, it is unlikely that you're going to see them in the United States again in the next several years. So we're very excited. There are 50 objects that tell the story not only of the creation of these tapestries, how they start with Raphael, what influenced Raphael, but how they eventually find their way to Dresden, and most important of all, how these objects influence generations of artists over 4 centuries. It's an amazing story. I think when you say copy, when you're a modernist, you say, oh, copy. It's not, this was a way of honoring, you know, knowing your art history, knowing antiquity, knowing other artists that came before you. This was a way of not only showing your own education and knowledge, but of honoring those who have come before you and what they achieved and how you extend that legacy. And so the way these compositions really transform European art over several centuries is part of this story. Now, we only get to do these great projects because of the support of all of you in this room and many, many others. I sometimes spend a lot of time listing names. There are all these wonderful names are in the exhibition, and please take time to think about people who make all of this possible at the museum. I do want to step away for a minute and introduce a very dear, we have people from all over here. We have not only is Stefan Koya here, the director of the Gemäldegalerie Gallery Altmeister, who you'll hear from in just a minute, but we also have Larissa Moore, who was his co-curator. We have Helen Cohn, who is a researcher at the Gemäldegalerie Gallery, and we have a very dear friend that we've known for several years now, Francesca Croce, who made an incredibly important contribution to this. And the Croces are here in Columbus, and there is a special painting that's here because they live in Columbus, Ohio, and it didn't go to Dresden, so you get a great idea to see that. But I want to introduce Herr Mosinger. I practiced, and then I screwed it up already, Herr Mosinger. But he is very important to us. That it is wonderful that he has traveled from Chicago to be here with us tonight. He is the Consul General of the Consulate for Germany in Chicago. And so he flew in specifically to be with us because one of the great supporters of this exhibition, of course, is our sister city, because in case There's someone here who doesn't know, Dresden is a sister city of Columbus, Ohio. So Helmer Singer, would you come up?
Thank you, Nanette, for this very kind introduction. And thank you to all of you for coming to this exhibition. I had the privilege to already walk through the exhibition. And I can't help remembering when you walk through this exhibition in awe, remembering what I learned in school and university as a motto of many Renaissance artists and those who followed them. They call themselves the dwarfs standing on the shoulders of giants. So we admire, we analyze, we interpret, we exhibit the masters, the giants. There are many learned people in this room who will tell you a lot about the history and the effect of all these wonderful pieces of art. They will give you new findings, new perspectives on them. And that is what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks here in Columbus. And I'm very grateful to the Columbus Museum of Art to bring all these scholars together. And they are looking at these masterpieces at various angles. Isn't that science at its best and art at its finest? Isn't that progress of knowledge and of understanding, even if we are the dwarfs standing admiring these pieces of art, we are still bigger than the giants on whose shoulders we stand. To quote a sentence of the German philosopher Johann Gottfried Herder, who coined this amended version of the old saying about 2 generations after Augustus acquired these tapestries. By the way, Herder lived around the same time when your constitution was adopted, and haven't we moved on since then in science, in knowledge, and in our ways of life? Still, we admire the craft of those who came before us, but we should not stand still admiring the ancestors. Our job is to climb on top of the shoulders of these giants and look further than they could do, and so being bigger than them. And that is what we are doing here. I'm so grateful to the Columbus Museum of Art, the Ohio State University, and the Gemäldegallery Dresden for this wonderful cooperation. And it's also a wonderful cooperation between Germany and the United States, and I think a lot has to do with the sister city between Dresden and Columbus. So I wish you a very wonderful evening and enjoy the exhibition, and think that you are the dwarfs, but you are standing on the shoulders of giants. Thank you.
I will be very quick now so we can get to our speakers, and Stefan Koyo is going to come and introduce our first 2 speakers, and of which he is one, I believe, of which he is. But I do want to, as always, to thank all the people that make this possible. I'm going to do the short list, but there is a much longer list in the exhibition. Please take time to look at it. Our presenting sponsors are Peggy and Bob Walter. Major sponsors, the Samuel Kress Foundation. We got a wonderful grant from the Kress Foundation. Hugh Westwater and Linda Larimer, Ann and Tom Hoagland, the Elizabeth S. Johnson Family Trust. But there are many, many more. And I always thank the Ohio Arts Council, the Greater Columbus Arts Council, Nationwide, and the Columbus Foundation. And finally, I would like to thank the Clybacker Fund of the Columbus Museum of Art. Some of you will remember Charles. People always associate Charles with fashion, and he was. I mean, he was a great fashion designer. But when Charles left money to the Columbus Museum of Art, he left it for a fund for excellence. And I think Charles would be thrilled with the excellence of this exhibition, and I think he's smiling down from wherever he is. And lastly, I want to thank lastly, but certainly not least, the talented team at the Columbus Museum of Art. The amount of work it takes to put this exhibition up is beyond imaginable for most of us. And I want to thank David Stark, and Carol Genshaft, who headed that team. I want to thank our Chief Registrar, Nicole Rome. I want to thank Greg Jones, who is, and through my entire directorship, has been the sort of the magician that makes it all work, and his team, which most importantly, Dave Holm. I want to thank Mason Macklin, who does so much work with connecting us to our audiences to the works. Amanda Kepner, all the other members of the learning team, Lucy Ackley and the advancement team. Yes, Lucy had to raise a lot of money for this. So I thank all of you. I thank all of them. And now on to the content of the evening. Stefan.
So, good evening. Larissa Moore is an expert in Renaissance drawing. She co-curated the exhibition with me for 2020, as Nanette said. And at the moment, Larissa is working on her dissertation on Giovanni da Udine, who worked in the workshop of Raphael and who also contributed elements of the tapestries, as we're going to point out. I am the director of the Gemäldegalerie Alte Meister, a painting collection, but also of the sculpture collection of the Staatliche Kunstsammlung in Dresden, so the state-owned art collections in Dresden, Germany. In 1514, around 1514, Pope Leo X commissioned these tapestries. And you have to know that tapestries were a means of representation, of showing your rank. They were the most expensive works of art imaginable. And the process of doing them was, an artist was commissioned to draw a cartoon, so have a design, then transfer it to a large paper cartoon. Then it would be sent to a weaver, and then it would take years to do those tapestries. And on the walls you have the set from Mortlake. But going back to Rome, Raphael, who was a genius in organizing his workshop, had a lot of commissions at the same time. He would work for the Stanza della Segnatura, for example, or he would work on a famous altarpiece, the Sistine Madonna, which today is in the holdings of the Gemäldegalerie in Dresden. And so he had to be very efficient in the way he organized his workshop.
Yeah, that's an important point, because the small images you see here on the presentation, they're actually 4 to 6 meters high, each of them. And they're pasted together of numerous pages of paper. And this, for example, was a work or a task that was done by the workshop artist. So Raphael, on the first step, did drawings from different angles of figures. He sometimes changed his mind, and you can really follow the process through the drawings. And then he, in his workshop, prepared these cartoons, which you can see here. So the cartoons are same size, preliminary drawings in a way that were used from the weavers to make the tapestries. So 7 of them are preserved today. You see them all here. But Raphael originally prepared 10 of them. And of course, as Stefan told you, Raphael was occupied with many, many commissions. So he had to rely on the help of his workshop assistants. So there were many trained artists that were part of this workshop. And they had different tasks. So, for example, they stood in as models for his drawings. They pasted together the cartoons you see here. They had jobs to transfer drawings to the cartoons. And with the help of them, he was able to make it possible to have these 10 large drawings, refined drawings, colored drawings, made to be sent to Brussels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they were sent to Brussels because in Flanders, the Flemish weavers were the most famous of the time, and they were really the experts and had the highest prestige. And Peter van Alst was the head of a workshop which was extremely famous, so the Pope went for the best of the time. And these large cartoons, they were sent to Brussels, and then in order to be woven, they were cut into strips. So they would make working copies of the cartoons, which would be used in front of the weavers, and on the wall next to them, they would have the cartoons by Raphael as a color reference. And to weave one cartoon would take up to 1.5 years. There would be 6 weavers on the loom next to each other working on these tapestries. And there were specialists for faces, for landscape, for flowers, etc. And the payment of those weavers was different. To do faces was, of course, more important and for that also more expensive.
Mm-hmm. And to really understand how much these tapestries were worth, you also have to know that the first set, so the Vatican set of which we're talking, the one prepared by Raphael, it also had silver and gold threads woven into the tapestries. So that, for example, if the room, the Sistine Chapel, was lit by candles, you could see the shining threads of gold and silver coming through the tapestry. So that also added to the worth, of course. And also, maybe an important note on that is that Leo X, so the Pope who commissioned that, of course wanted to compete with his predecessor Julius II, who commissioned the Michelangelo ceiling painting in the Sistine Chapel. So the tapestries also were supposed to show his wealth and also his patronship in that way.
It's also the dimensions, the huge dimensions speak of this. But it's interesting that even Raphael refers to Michelangelo, who did the ceiling paintings of the Sistine Chapel, because he changes his style. So every artist stands, as you said before, stands on the shoulders of others. We all speak like our parents. So there's nobody without a ground to stay on. And Raphael, when he starts his career in Umbria, he works like Perugino. Then he goes to Florence. He sees the work of Leonardo, and he radically changes his style. And then he goes to Rome, and Michelangelo, who tried to really keep the chapel closed, and so that nobody could see it, but there must have been a moment when Raphael was able to sneak in and see the ceiling. Raphael realized, well, this is a new way of telling stories, and that is what you see in the tapestries. There's a new monumental style. You have just a few figures, and you have what made these tapestries so famous. You have these speaking gestures. So you immediately understand what these stories tell you. Your gaze is really led by the way persons look at each other, mm-hmm. and how they point at each other, etc.
So what we want to show you with this slide is, so we talked about the preparational process and the making of the cartoons, which you see on the left side. And those cartoons, as we said, were sent to Brussels then. And they were cut in stripes, and they were put in the loom. So because they were afraid to damage Raphael's original cartoons, which were so precious and colored, they made like a second set of cartoons. They pricked the outlines of each figure and transferred it to a new giant sheet of paper, and then they cut it into strips and put it in the loom. And because of the weaving process, the tapestry, which you see on the right, of course, is mirrored. So just to give you an idea, if in the exhibition you see the same composition over and over again in different directions, that is because the cartoon is reversed in the process of weaving. And what you also see here is the borders of the Vatican tapestry. So Raphael specifically designed these for Pope Leo X, the commissioner, and it dealt with the life of Giovanni de' Medici before he became Pope Leo X. And of course, they're very specific specifically addressed to the patron. And we're also going to show you in later sets, and also with the Dresden set of tapestries, that this was changed for each patron, and each patron could add a border or the coat of arms. So we're going to show you that as well.
And Raphael really revolutionized the way to do tapestries. Maybe we could show the next one. Because in Flanders, what they would do, there's the Sistine Chapel and the ceiling we were referring to, and the stanze which Raphael was doing at the same time for the Pope. But in what was the usual way to do tapestries in Flanders was to have a lot of detail and elements. So there was like a horror vacui. They were filled with details. So when the cartoons arrived in Brussels, the weavers were afraid of these vast segments just of sky or meadow in the foreground. So even the dress of Christ, they would alter and add golden stars, as you can see in the right slide. And they would add things in the foreground which are not in the cartoon, but they, as I said, they maybe thought that these images were a little bit poor or too simple, and added details. And to give an idea how Flemish tapestries looked at that time, these are very beautiful examples which are also in our collection in Dresden. But you see there's not much space left. And you really can tell, and they are even later than the Raphael tapestries we're talking about. So you really can tell how modern, or even this one.
Even busier.
Even busier, yes. And you really can tell how modern, how revolutionary the design of Raphael was. These also have gold thread in them. They're extremely precious, and 3 more survived and are in the Metropolitan Museum of this cycle, and 4 are in Dresden at the moment.
Mm-hmm. And to explain how these tapestries, or the cartoons we've showed you before, the Raphael cartoons, were used again and again, it's important to say that the cartoons, when the tapestries were done in Brussels, they first remained there. So Raphael died, and then the patron, Pope Leo X, died, and one of the cartoons entered a Venetian collection Grimani, pretty soon, but the other cartoons, we don't know where they were. And then over 100 years later, in 1623, they suddenly emerged again in Genoa, in Italy. And Rubens was the one who recommended to buy them to Charles I, so later Charles, King of England, Charles I, but then Prince of Wales, because he, 4 years earlier, founded his own tapestry manufactory in Mortlake, which is pretty close to London. And there he used the cartoons of Raphael to produce new sets of tapestries, which also applies for the Dresden set. And so this was a common practice to reuse cartoons and make different sets of them. And also in Dresden. Oh yeah, sorry. Just one before? Thank you. So here you see Charles I of England, which you will also see in this beautiful portrait by Anthony van Dyck in the exhibition. He was the one who founded the Mortlake manufactory.
And he really thought of art as a means of representation. He tried to gather one of the most exquisite collections of especially paintings in Europe. But after his beheading, unfortunately, Cromwell sold everything off, and then really the collectors of Europe rushed to get the very best. And there has been a project at the Royal Academy about 3 years ago where they tried to reunite the collection of Charles I, which really had the very best of the time in it.
Yeah.
And also he made Van Dyck his court painter. Very good choice. Yes.
Yeah. So maybe we can tell you something now about the Dresden set, which you of course will see in the exhibition. So as I mentioned, it was produced in the Mortlake manufactory. And actually, we don't know today who commissioned our Dresden set, because you would have the borders and on top the coat of arms. But the coat of arms was cut out of the borders when the set entered the Dresden collection. So today, we don't really know who commissioned the Dresden tapestries in the first place. But we do know that they were made in the second quarter of the 17th century. And that they were bought by Jacob Heinrich von Flemming, which you see here. And then he offered them to August I, better known as Augustus the Stark.
Yeah, we have to say he was asked to offer them. So in 28, Augustus the Strong bought them for Dresden, and for him they had a certain importance. As you may have heard and will hear again, Augustus the Strong and his son Augustus III were active, isn't a word for that, had a frenzy of collecting. They were extremely wealthy because there were silver mines in Saxony, which gave them the opportunity to buy nearly anything they wanted, and they would, for example, to acquire the Sistine Madonna by Raphael, they would spend so much money. I was told you could build an entire city, a quarter of a city, with this amount of money. And Augustus the Strong had a passion for porcelain. You know, Meissen was founded under his reign. So he collected porcelain from China, Korea, and of course from the own production. He was very fond of sculpture. He acquired two of the most famous antiquity collections of the time, and he began collecting paintings. And his son would follow in a quantity which is nearly unimaginable. So during 1 year and a half, they would acquire more than 700 paintings, and the names among these acquisitions were Vermeer and Titian and Correggio, and you name it. So it was incredible. And for Augustus the Strong, these art collections were really a means of playing within the courts of Europe, showing off how important Saxony and the House of Wettin was among them. But he always wanted to become king, and so he did whatever was necessary to bribe aristocrats in Poland, and in the end he succeeded. He became king of Poland, so it could carry the coat of arms with the crown. Mm-hmm. And as you know, Poland is a Catholic country, and the king had to be Catholic. So coming from the homeland of the Reformation, he converted into Catholicism. And so also under this light, the acquisition of these tapestries, which were commissioned by the Pope and which showed the lives of St. Peter and St. Paul, the first apostles and most important apostles of the church, St. Peter being the head and St. Paul preaching to the Gentiles, had an aspect for Augustus the Strong to bring himself in line as a defensor Christianorum, as a defender of the right faith.
And also he was standing on someone's shoulders because in Dresden it was established to collect tapestries. So if you would take, for example, the inventory from the 16th century, it would list 230 tapestries. And you have to imagine each tapestry would be maybe like 4 to 6 meters big. So they were kind of an important part of the collection. And as you would see in this drawing, which we're showing here, they were presented in the electoral chambers or some part of the royal palace. And unfortunately, during a fire in 1701, most of the collection burned. But luckily for us, today, the set you're going to see came to Dresden later, so 22 years later. But there was already kind of an established line of collecting tapestries in Dresden as well.
And tapestries were used to enhance church festivities, high feasts, for example, like Christmas or Easter, or to welcome an important person. So you decorate the rooms according to the event with different tapestries.
Right.
And I should also mention, because I made this remark of bribery, in most of Europe you would inherit being king, but in Poland the king was elected. So you can imagine that Russia, of course, and Prussia and all others tried to influence the election, and that's how Augustus the Strong was able to become king in Poland, being German or Saxon.
Yeah.
So.
So here you see a photo of a setup in the Dresden Gemäldegalerie where the tapestries were presented. This is probably around 1910. But they weren't always on display.
Yeah, true. Mm-hmm.
So this is also kind of a special occasion we had in our 2020 exhibition because, as I said, they're not always on display, but they were restored. And you want to say something about the restoration?
Yes, it took several years to restore them. This was funded by an important German foundation who is keen in founding conservation projects. And as you can see, looking at the difference, the before and after, they were essentially cleaned. They built a huge table with a special mechanism that they would use purified water, and then there was a certain device that would suck the dirty water from below this table, and then they would just stitch and repair missing parts. But there's no addition, so it's just the original that has been repaired, and it regained these wonderful colors, as you will see in the exhibition in a moment.
So we're going to make a cut here a bit and talk a bit more about what you're going to see in the exhibition. And a big part of the exhibition is the reception throughout the centuries. So you will learn that Raphael's compositions were disseminated pretty quickly through print. So this is an important thing to stress because Raphael had several engravers, as you can see, for example, Agostino Veneziano and others, Marcantonio Raimondi, I will show you later. And they worked specifically for him and disseminated his compositions. So what is even more interesting about this engraving is that the tapestries were probably commissioned around 1514, and the cartoons were finished like 2 years later, 1516, and then sent to Brussels. And we know for sure, because it is stated, that this engraving is also from 1516. That means that the compositions were already reproduced and disseminated already before the tapestries were done, and already before the tapestries came to Rome. So Raphael worked with Marcantonio Raimondi as well, and gave him drawings, modelli that he prepared, and that his engraver then would put into an engraving, a copper plate engraving, and disseminate. So it would have been possible for not people only being in Rome, but in other parts of Italy or in Europe to see Raphael's compositions pretty early.
to tell what a modello is. So
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah. That's, so Raphael did like a refined drawing at the end of his whole drawing process before transferring it to the bigger cartoon. And these refined drawings, like of the finished compositions, he would then give to his engravers. So in this example, the Paul preaching at Athens, you're also going to see that one in the exhibition. And his engraver would then put it into print. And I've told you about the reversal process in the beginning of the cartoon and the tapestry. And because of the technique of the engraving, you would also find an engraving being mirrored. You can try to look for those reversals in the exhibitions as well.
and the modello was also presented to the patrons who had the commission, and the patron would say, okay, this is a design I like. So it was the last step before the execution.
Right. So in print was pretty important for Raphael as well, as I've told you. So in print, you wouldn't only have these two exact copies of Raphael's drawings, but pretty early on, there were other artists copying Raphael's compositions. So with Ugo da Carpi, who put his composition in woodcuts, but you'll also find some other variations, as with Christ and the Woman Taken in Adultery. You're also going to see in the exhibition where some elements of Raphael's compositions were taken. So you would find, for example, the Solomon columns and some figures. So it's not that the artists of the following centuries always copied the exact composition they had studied, but they also took like fragments or some parts of the architecture. So you will realize that pretty early on there were many artists taking inspiration from Raphael. We've also talked before about the contribution of the workshop, and Raphael understood in a certain way to make use of the specialized way of working of his different workshop members. And also we were lucky in our Dresden exhibition, unfortunately not here because drawings are supposed to rest in a way after being shown or being exposed to light. So we were only able to show the drawing in the Dresden exhibition. But we were able to find a drawing by one of Raphael's workshop members, Giovanni da Udine, who prepared two of the cranes in the miraculous draft of fishes, because he was a specialist in animal and plant studies. So he would be responsible in the miraculous draft for the birds in the sky, the fishes in the boat, or the birds standing on the shore. And we're showing this just to give you an impression of how each workshop member contributed under the guidance of Raphael to the cartoons.
And the crane had a certain symbolism to it.
Oh yeah, the crane had a certain symbolism, which was also important for the Pope, because they are standing for the virtue of vigilance, and that's of course something the Pope would also like to adorn himself with. And also they're some kind of fishermen because they're looking to eat fish, and in the tapestry you would have of course Peter as a fisherman being depicted along with the cranes. So you can see that even details as animals are really well thought through by Raphael. Oh.
Yeah, this is the Dresden set you're going to see. You will also see that the preservation is different. Some have been shown a lot and have unfortunately lost some of their colors. Others are really brilliant and nearly glooming with their colors, because the threads used are linen, silk, and wool, and they would use organic, so colors made of plants or minerals, and of course they are fragile to light, so they will fade if they are exposed too much to light. And it's especially the yellow tones which fade first. But I'm sure you will be stunned how brilliant, full of color they still are, how colorful.
Yeah. And as we said before, it was divided, like the whole set was divided between the Petrine and the Pauline cycle, so Peter and Paul as the apostles being part of the narrative. And the miraculous draught of fish you see here on the left is one of the most copied for sure. And I'm sure you will realize that going through the exhibition that this was inspiration for many artists. What you also can see here, which I think is an interesting detail, is that you see the boat of the miraculous draught of fishes, and then you would see the tip of the boat continuing in Christ Church to Peter. So some of the compositions are even thought together and like a continuous narration. And I think the narration, the gestures you mentioned, pointing fingers, hands, which are all adding to the content Raphael wanted to transport, are crucial and central to his compositions.
And if you look at the sky, you see this is a huge homogeneous zone where not much is happening. So that is why the weavers in Brussels were so concerned what to do with it. And it really was a challenge because you need threads which are evenly colored in order to be able to weave those segments. Mm-hmm. And Raphael also was, he not only was a draftsman, a gifted painter, he also was an architect. And you can tell, looking at these tapestries, how good an architect he was, because the way these buildings are rendered and the three-dimensionality of these images is really stunning. And at the same time, Raphael was extremely interested in antiquity, and the Pope made him responsible for excavations. And Raphael even, he died so young, but he intended to do a list of antiquities in Rome, and in all his tapestries you find references to antiquity. So he used famous sculptures or architecture like the central buildings, the round building, for example, here in the back, for his compositions.
And you will also find that in exhibitions. So we have some plaster casts made after Roman ancient sculptures or marbles that will give you an idea of what Raphael studied or what he was also able to study during that time in Rome, because Rome was the center of art during that time. And Raphael, of course, was as well influenced by many things.
And these things were really excavated exactly at that time. So, for example, in 1506, Laocoon was unearthed and was a sensation, of course, that Michelangelo immediately tried to finish what was missing in a way. And we are lucky, so in many museums, plaster casts, especially during the last decades, haven't been highly valued, and they gave them away or even threw them away. But in Dresden, we are very fond of them. Among the 28,000 pieces of the sculpture collection, we have 4,500 plaster casts, which gives us the opportunity, if we do an exhibition and we look for a cast, we almost always have it. And you will see, they really enhance the exhibition. They really give you this three-dimensional idea, and you can tell what Raphael has seen.
Yeah, and also what he captured in drawing.
Yeah.
So,
and these were also educated references, as they are called. So the patrons who knew about antiquity would enjoy seeing those references in the depictions. And later on, if Rubens quotes Raphael this also gives pleasure to the patron acquiring the ruins.
Yeah. And I think what's also good to add on the educated quotes, citations of ancient buildings and so on is the collaborative effort that it really needs to do a tapestry. So there, of course, not only the artist, patron in the beginning, of course, the artist, his workshop, but also sometimes people who are trying to put together a narration, a theme. So in Papal Rome, these were humanists or writers or maybe someone from the clergy adding to the program that was intended to then be made by the artist. And then, of course, the weavers and the head of the tapestry manufactory. So it was very much a collaborative effort to have such a tapestry in the end. And just, oh, sorry, that was too quick. Could you go back? I'm sorry. Yeah, just to give you an idea of how the tapestries looked when we displayed them in Dresden in 2020. And there you can already spot one of the sculptures as a reference to the ferryman in the Miraculous Draught of Fish, being a small river god, a bronze of a small river god.